This is a short video about the fact that school children will now be allowed to attend school without wearing face masks in the classrooms or corridors. I want to reiterate that the policy of forcing school children into masks has been an abomination. It has been child abuse. It has been degrading and cruel. And you don't have to take my word for it. I asked a young lad who lives on my estate what it was like being forced to wear a mask in school for hours upon end. He said it was torture. Torture. Britain's school children have been tortured for months. And not only was the mask policy inherently cruel, it was also utterly pointless. It did no good whatsoever to anybody. Whether they were masked or not, school children and teachers breathed into the surrounding air, and they breathed in from the surrounding air. You might as well have made the kids wear snorkels for all the good it did. Let's be absolutely clear about this. The mandatory masks for school children policy was one of the biggest crimes in modern British history. The culprits should hang their heads in shame, including this cowardly, deranged government which deserves a big share of the blame. But I also want to reiterate my contempt for the teaching union teachers who made their return to work conditional upon mandatory masks for the kids. My message to these teachers, most of whom are militant socialists, is this: you are cowards, maniacs and bullies. Your job is to protect and nurture children, not abuse children to supposedly protect yourselves. A word is also due about any teachers who disagreed with the policy but went along with it anyway. You are complicit. I've been a teacher. I taught in schools for a year. There is no way I would have stood in front of a group of masked children and acted like it was acceptable. And let me also say something to the parents who allowed their children to be subjected to this cruelty. What on earth were you thinking? The only way I can get my head around the insanity of this policy is to consider it a form of scapegoating. People taking out their own fears on others who are weaker than them. You've heard of the phrase pecking order. In times of stress or food scarcity, hens will often attack the lowest ranking hens, sometimes pecking them to death. Similarly, the human race has a long and barbaric history of child sacrifice. I think in the last few months the welfare of Britain's school children has been sacrificed to make cowardly adults feel better about themselves. Shame on every single one of you. In particular, shame on the teachers who took out their cowardice on their pupils. It's also worth remembering that teaching union teachers have done even more damage than this. On January the 5th this year, Britain entered its third lockdown, the longest one yet. We haven't even properly emerged from it. The lockdown happened a day after the government had tried to reopen most of the primary schools in the country. Boris Johnson and the Education Minister had both been on national TV to tell us that the schools were definitely safe. Unfortunately, meanwhile, the Education Union, the largest teaching union in Britain with around 500,000 members, was advising its members not to return to their classrooms, saying that teachers had a right to work in a safe workplace. We can only imagine what happened behind the scenes and what threats, if any, were made on the day the primary schools reopened. And we can only assume that the government issued a national lockdown 24 hours later to avoid the embarrassment of a confrontation with the teachers. Presumably the government was too cowardly to suddenly close the schools again and admit that the teachers had forced the climb down. So instead, we were all sent into lockdown. With this in mind, it's worth wondering how much pressure and what kind of pressure has been exerted on the government by the public sector all the way through this debacle. We know that a third lockdown wasn't what the government wanted. They were trying to open schools 24 hours before. We know that Boris Johnson said he'd rather see bodies piled high than lock down a second time. We know that for several weeks before the first lockdown, his government pursued a herd immunity strategy. We know that during this time, his chief science advisor was telling us, rightly, that COVID-19 would be a very mild illness for most people and that closing down public gatherings wouldn't have much of an effect on transmission. We know that something made Johnson do a dramatic U-turn in mid-March 2020. We know that millions of shrieking socialists in the public sector have been vilifying Johnson all the way through, accusing him of not doing enough to protect the country and accusing him of being responsible for people's deaths. We know that public sector unions keep sending letters to the government, making hysterical demands and accusations. We know that public sector workers have been among the biggest beneficiaries of the lockdowns, whether working from home or going on furlough, or indeed, if you work in the NHS, having the whole country turned upside down to allegedly protect you. Britain's public sector socialists wouldn't be the first socialists in history to have their lives made easier by trashing the economy while forcing some people to work harder than ever. Nor would they be the first socialists in history to insist on abolishing the free association of people, whether in communities or families. None of this madness is in any way exceptional in the shameful history of socialism. If anything good comes out of the horrendous policy of forcing school children into face masks, I hope it makes people more aware of the role of the public sector in the corona panic debacle. I want people to shine a spotlight on the public sector, including the NHS. I want investigative journalists to try to figure out if public sector unions have driven all 3 lockdowns. Of course, if the government has been capitulating to the public sector all the way through this debacle, ministers are hardly likely to admit it. But that's all the more reason for anti-lockdown campaigners to try to establish the truth in this matter. If it turns out that the government has been bullied by the unions, maybe there's a way out of this mess. A public and media outcry against the unions could see Johnson unseated and replaced by a Conservative who will confront public sector socialists rather than capitulate to them. If not, we could be trapped indefinitely in a whirlpool of lies, and we run the risk that the disgusting policy of forcing school children into masks will be reinstated further down the line. We must make sure that it never happens again.